Hello, this is Darrell Castle with today's Castle Report. This is Friday, the 15th day of August in the year of our Lord 2025. I will be talking about the face-to-face meeting between President Trump and President Putin going on today, this very day in Anchorage, Alaska. Which player has the most at risk? Which player has the most to lose from this meeting? We don't know the results of the meeting yet, but the promise of the meeting is something to discuss. Why have this meeting in Alaska, not some European capital? Who knows the answer to that for sure, but a reasonable guess would be that Mr. Putin is under sanctions that make it very difficult for him to travel in Europe. And after all, Russia and Alaska go way back. I won't go back any further than the 1860s. When both nations were involved in very disastrous wars with very different results. The U.S. Civil War resulted in a Union victory but cost many lives, split the country for over 100 years. Russia was also involved in a war in Crimea against England and France, which it lost, and which had catastrophic loss of life, completely depleted the Russian treasury. Tsar Alexander II was desperate for cash, and in 1867 he negotiated a deal with the United States to sell the Americans Alaska for $7.1 million. That seems like a bargain for the U.S., and it was. But remember, that was 165 years ago, approximately, when $7.1 million was real money. For example, this week, in contrast, the U.S. just passed $37 trillion in debt and is now dangerously close to $1 trillion per year in interest payments. What about today, though? Why Alaska? For one thing, Anchorage lies 4,350 miles from Moscow and 3,400 miles from Washington, so it is a comparable trip for both. It was hastily arranged, we are told, that the meeting last week between Mr. Putin and Trump's negotiator Steve Witkoff brought a request from Mr. Putin for a face-to-face meeting with President Trump, which was quickly agreed to. Vice President Vance told us that Mr. Zelensky will not be in attendance because his presence would not be productive. I don't blame the U.S. for that. I would not have invited him either. This is a war between the U.S. and Russia. Everybody seems to know that except Mr. Zelensky. His country has provided the bodies for the proxy grist mill, but it is a U.S. war. My hope and my prayer are that Trump will continue his quest for the Nobel Peace Prize. But in regard to Mr. Zelensky, after 45 years as a lawyer, after countless mediations conducted, I have learned that more is usually accomplished if the two competing sides are kept separate, with the mediator going back and forth between the two. Ukraine and Gaza are the two blights on Trump's Nobel Peace Prize resume at this point, but this is a chance to resolve at least one of them. And it's right in his hands. That chance is right in his hands today. The Europeans have basically already rejected the deal, even though they don't know what it is yet. If he makes a deal with Putin and the Europeans reject it, if I were him, I would just say, okay, all right, since you prefer war to peace, you pay for it, because there will be no more American weapons, no more American money poured down this rat hole. Polls show that 70% of Ukrainians want to end the war right now. Zelensky may want to fight to the last Ukrainian and the last U.S. dollar, but his people don't. Let's take a quick look at Trump's peace resume thus far. I argue that in many ways he's the most anti-war president in recent history. In his first term, he brokered the Abraham Accords that normalized relations between Israel and four Arab nations, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco. The agreement ended hostility that had existed since Israel's founding in 1948. This was the first real peace deal since President Carter's deal between Egypt and Israel. Full relations with those four countries brought much prosperity to them. Trade deals, embassies, air service, and all that stuff. He met with the little rocket man on the rocket man's home soil of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, thereby lowered tensions on the Korean Peninsula and sent a message that diplomacy was at least possible if people could just talk. This week, Armenia and Azerbaijan signed a formal peace agreement at the White House, ending a bloody war that had cost thousands of lives. Trump brought the two presidents together and brokered a deal thought to be impossible because of the many decades the conflict had lasted. A catastrophic war between Pakistan and India was well underway, with both sides suffering casualties when Trump intervened with diplomacy. The agreement called for the end of military hostilities, communications channels reopened to coordinate security for both sides. Since both countries are nuclear armed, the potential for disaster was obvious. Last month, Cambodia and Thailand reached a Trump-negotiated ceasefire in their cross-border war that killed many people, left hundreds of thousands without shelter. In June of this year, Rwanda, where the genocide that cost perhaps 1 million lives occurred, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo were engaged in a war that had gone hot and warm but never cold for decades. Trump negotiated a deal wherein both sides agreed to respect borders, end aggression against the other side, perform joint security coordination. Those things I've mentioned make up a pretty good resume for peace, unfortunately. Under most presidents, the CIA wants the wars to get hotter and to feed the always hungry appetites of those people over at the defense contractors, but apparently not so much today. Gaza is a problem, that's for sure, but Israel is the one that has to be dealt with in solving that problem. Dealing with Netanyahu is not so simple. Whatever hold he has over American leadership seems rather shameful to me, and if I were an American leader and I didn't carry any dirt on me that Netanyahu could use, I would be embarrassed at having to kowtow to our ally, our special ally, in such a fashion. But how can we know for sure? Israel is a problem, but not the problem for today. Right now, Russia and Ukraine are before us to be considered. So Mr. Putin, we are told, requested this face-to-face meeting so he could let Trump know what his real concerns are. Thereby, just maybe those concerns would be addressed. If we think of this meeting as a poker game with Trump, Putin, and Zelensky as the players, which player has the most at risk? Which has the most skin in the game? I think Putin has the most at risk and the most to lose, because even though Russia seems to be gaining momentum in the war, Putin's goals have not been met. Like the U.S. in Vietnam, even though your army is not defeated on the battlefield, by not winning the war, you lose the war. Putin's people are getting restless, wondering if any of the sacrifice is worth it if there is no victory. In addition, the Russian economy is suffering under U.S. sanctions, so a successful meeting is vital for Russia and for Mr. Putin. Mr. Zelensky also has a lot at risk, but not as much as Putin. Ukraine has no pretensions about being a great country. Its losses have been horrible. Zelensky may run around Europe begging for money, but the truth is his army is almost out of manpower. Old men and boys right now man the ranks. His lines are crumbling before the Russian attacks. Zelensky wants a simple ceasefire, especially an aerial ceasefire, to stop the Russian drone attacks. Russia has been attacking Kiev with drones, but in response to the Ukrainian attack inside Russia, 2,700 miles from the Ukrainian border against the Russian nuclear bomber bases, Trump has only his own reputation as a peacemaker, along with U.S. prestige at risk, along with, of course, a few $100 billion of debt. Therefore, my conclusion is this meeting is more important to Putin than to anyone else. He can keep fighting, maybe eventually prevail, but at what cost? Does he want Russia out of the sanctions and into the normal family of nations? Time will tell if Trump has those chips on the table. Russia has apparently signaled the U.S. it would like to end the war if it could keep Crimea and the eastern provinces that it currently occupies. Mr. Putin is at least willing and able to talk to President Trump, something he was unable to accomplish with President Biden or with Victoria Nuland, Biden's coup instigator. The president's press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, quote, "The president is agreeing to this meeting at the request of President Putin, and the goal of this meeting is to walk away with a better understanding of how we can end this war. Sitting face-to-face rather than speaking over the telephone will give this president the best indication of how to end this war and where this is headed, end quote. Meanwhile, folks, Mr. Zelensky has a slightly different view. Quote, any decisions made against us, any decisions made without Ukraine, they are simultaneously decisions against peace. These are dead decisions. They will never work. And what we all need is a real living peace, one that people will respect, end quote. Well, to me, that would be a very insulting, a very infuriating statement, and as President of the United States, I would not put up with it, but we will see how Mr. Trump views it. The Europeans seem to have Ukraine's back on this issue. Their statement is that any peace has to include Ukraine. Well, the Europeans are irrelevant right now. They don't even have a seat at this table. Well, then what would be the best way out of this debacle? What would the best way out look like from my limited perspective? Trump will say to them, this is the deal, folks. There's no other deal. If you don't accept this deal and live with it, then you're on your own. So goodbye and good luck. The deal I have agreed to with Mr. Putin is that Crimea remains Russian, where it has belonged for hundreds of years. Russia keeps the Russian-speaking eastern provinces that it occupies as a buffer against Ukraine and NATO. We mutually pledge ourselves to maintain security and respect for each other's territories. The sanctions imposed on Russia because of Russia's initial invasion are hereby lifted, and full economic cooperation between the United States and Russia are now in force. Furthermore, we acknowledge that the Nord Stream pipeline will be back in place with shared costs of rebuilding and repair. Europe will have plenty of cheap natural gas again and will therefore not have to buy it from the U.S. and transport it across the ocean. Everyone stops fighting immediately, and with peace will come much prosperity for everybody, safety for the people of all three nations. Finally, folks, that is what I think should and could happen, but there are many things such as rebuilding, the cost of rebuilding, that time will not permit me to cover in this report. At least that's the way I see it, folks. Until next time, this is Darrell Castle. Thanks for listening.